Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Global Energy Outlook Forum. It is January 8th. It is 5 p.m. in the UAE, at least, and obviously a little bit earlier and a little bit later, wherever you may be. If you're watching on LinkedIn, we have 500 followers registered there on this session, on this forum, and across other social channels. So I welcome everybody. I suppose energy security is the biggest topic of 2025, no doubt about that. And the question is, as we go into 2026 and we look forward, does that continue to be the principal sort of goal, North Star for everyone? And why is Europe seemingly not quite getting there? It has not, in its big pivot to US LNG, it hasn't really reduced its risk, its exposure, its vulnerability on energy security. Or is there a contravening position on that? And maybe is 2026 the year when they finally get things right, everybody moves to Greenland and pitches a tent and starts burning the firewood if they had any. But let's welcome our panelists, Marc Ostwald, Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM Investor Services. Looking into 2026 and beyond, what is the single most important variable that could reshape Europe's energy security outlook?
I think it's probably going to be geopolitics, simply from the fact that Europe is basically a net importer of anything that it requires to generate power. It's got very little, yes, there is wind, but that's intermittent. Yes, there is solar, but otherwise it's always reliant on imports. And with such a charged environment as we have, also, the global economic outlook. I mean, sadly for Europe, actually, a strong global economic upturn would be very, very bad news. Particularly, if that is likely, as more than likely, it's going to come from Asia because they're the biggest competitors for LNG. So, and the other aspect is the internal politics of Europe, a lack of unity and a lack of ability to unify around any form of policy, whether it relates to Russia, whether it relates to energy, whether it relates to reforming the EU. They said, and there's a lack of leadership, so it remains very vulnerable, basically, to its own structural problems and to the problems in the world, all the tensions in the world that we have.
Let's welcome David Wech, Chief Economist at Vortexa. David, obviously we went in Europe from a heavily dependent, all our eggs in one basket of Russian pipeline gas, principally with bits and pieces from elsewhere, but a sort of over-dependence and what turned out to be a high-risk but fairly cheap strategy for many decades, to one that seems to be the problem trying to be solved with the same but opposite being US LNG. Why has this pivot not reduced the risk, the sort of energy security risk of Europe? Or do you have a contrarian view that maybe it has?
I do have a contrarian view. I think Europe is extremely well placed in terms of supply security compared to other markets. I'm talking here for LNG, but also for crude oil and refined products. If you look at Vortexa, we have the world split into 24 shipping regions. And if you look at where the seaborne energy supply comes from, so to say, only 21% come from the Gulf of Mexico, the #1 supply region. And more than half of those shipping regions contribute significantly to European seaborne energy supply. If you look in comparison at Northeast Asia, China, South Korea, Japan, they rely close to 40% to the Middle East Gulf. And the Middle East Gulf is a true security risk because it depends on the Strait of Hormuz. Europe is, of course, has its exposure if you want to the Suez Canal, but you can just sail around Africa as the ships are doing for the last couple of years. So Europe has access to US supply, to Middle Eastern supply if necessary, to African supply, to Latin American supply. There is a lot. There is also, of course, nearby supply sources in the North Sea, in North Africa, in the Caspian. So there is a lot of alternative supplies on the gas side, on the oil side, that Europe can tap into easily on a seaborne basis, high level of supply security. So I think that's actually a pretty good position to be in. I would say it's a much better position today than it was before the Russian-Ukraine war started, because there it was dependent on landlocked supply. That is, if you lose that in the short term, you have no alternatives. The European system has been rechecked.
But let me just challenge the thesis there. Obviously, I gave you a few minutes to sort of lay out that argument, but ultimately, why then has Europe, I mean, you mentioned a lot of diversification there, but Europe has just signed on to a trade agreement with the US that essentially is, we're going to buy all your LNG for the next 5,000 years at this exorbitant amount of money that we really don't have anymore.
European gas purchases are linked to the spot price, and that's another good news for next year. The chances are very high that LNG prices will come down. There is a lot of new LNG supply in the pipeline for next year, for the year after next year. Already this year, we had a 7% year-on-year increase in global supply. So basically, there's ample supply. Europe, of course, generally speaking, it does make sense to use quite some supplies from the US Gulf Coast because it's relatively close. Yeah? It's over in, I don't know, 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the place. So why not? Yeah. And it's a competitive.
Why not? Because ultimately, I suppose you get to be held over a big barrel. Let's go to James McCallum, CEO of Xergy Group and professor at Strathclyde University. Your thoughts on the thesis, why is Europe's LNG pivot not reduce the risk? And just to pick up on one of the points Dave mentioned there, which was that Europe's own North Sea, its own sort of supply opportunity. Norway obviously is Exhibit A, poster child that does amazingly well in class all the time. And then there's the other poster child on the other side of the North Sea, your neck of the woods. How much is Europe sort of not, let's say, reinforcing its own energy security risk profile by not harvesting its own energy?
Well, not harvesting its own domestic ability to produce energy, in my own personal opinion, is madness in the current economic environment, and certainly. There are two very different strategies shown between Europe and the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom is pursuing a singular strategy, very heavily focused around renewable energy. It's turning its back on its own ability to domestically produce, particularly gas, in favor of more carbon-intensive imports from the United States, which it still relies on, heavily relies on the United States, which is the argument which you're trying to make. But not only is it sort of turning its back on that, it's not investing enough into carbon storage either, which I suspect we'll come back to later on in the conversation. That was a really great introduction for me from both Marc and David. And I find myself strangely in the middle of both of those arguments, which I guess means you've thought your panel through pretty well. The reality is this week, I guess we all feel a great deal more vulnerable to a single source of supply of LNG coming from the United States. If you roll the clock back 4 or 5 weeks ago, we probably wouldn't have felt quite so vulnerable. But very much the European energy story is a work in progress. If you take a look at the very, very heavy emphasis into renewable energy, that was coming even before you saw, Germany pull away from nuclear, which of course Europe is now moving back towards. as has now been reclassified as a sustainable fuel source by the European Union. But even before Germany moved away from nuclear, and definitely before the sort of the Russian-Ukraine issue, which caused obviously massive problems for Europe with regards to Russian gas pipeline importation, Europe was betting heavily on renewables. And it's betting even heavier now, but it is definitely a work in progress. I think it's coming back to David's point, still primary energy demand in Europe, roughly 70% of that comes from fossil fuels, but that will be halved over the course of the next 20, 25 years. So the issue that you're talking about, very much around, does Europe find itself very vulnerable, is in historical terms, relative historical terms, a short-term issue, if it is an issue at all. It's not a longer-term issue because as Europe moves away from heavy reliance on fossil fuels only, it will become more and more stable. And interestingly, as a contrarian to the point which Marc makes, whilst I totally agree with Marc that Europe lacks currently cohesive, joined-up leadership, the relative stability in Europe is an opportunity, and it remains an opportunity.
Well, on that point, Marc, just picking up on that, is this, Europe is, and it wouldn't be alone on that, but ultimately often can miss the opportunity when windows appear to sort of advance things. And there was a big $1 billion, $1 trillion euro fund for the transition and for all sorts of elements of implementation. It seems it's got sort of bogged down in a lot of bureaucracy. We have the East Med, which is there for the taking, so to speak, if to put a major kind of Monroe Doctrine approach to engagement. Turkey sitting there like the abandoned bride at the wedding, looking once again to be embraced as an incredible bridge and source of energy. Just talk to some of those windows of opportunity as we step into a new year. Do any of them seem like they could be a game changer in the year ahead?
To a certain extent, not. I think they are all potentially very much positive. And my initial argument basically is around actually the issue is not gas, the issue is power prices. And if Europe actually can't find a way of reducing its power prices, which are administered prices, every country has their own particular model. There are some overarching rules, but Europe has a problem that now power prices are more closely aligned with carbon prices than natural gas. And they're going up because the carbon price is going up. Unless Europe actually addresses the disadvantages of everything it's doing to make the energy transformation, it's creating all sorts of hurdles to itself, basically because of its regulations. And as long as those regulations continue to pressure power prices higher, because people have to adhere to the various regulations, it's not going to be able to strike that advantage. It hasn't got.
I heard an incredible data point by Christine Lagarde the other day when talking about the tariffs and Trump and all the usual noise. And she said, listen, within Europe, we're charging each other nearly 100% tariffs for trade and services moving across the borders.
Yeah, and that's another aspect of it. It's the structural disadvantage and its inability to reform because of this is where I'm talking about the leadership. There is no cohesiveness.
Even in this moment of urgency, David, the idea that there would be, I want to just sort of take your view on that. Obviously, you're drawing a positive outline. Where can it improve, even though you have a positive view on Europe's position? Where do you think it will improve? There are certain developments that will come in the coming year or two. Where do you see more improvement that can make this system more robust, more secure in this mad dash across the world. I mean, America just took over a sovereign country in South America. I mean, call it what you will, take away the leader. They just captured the world's largest oil reserves for their future. What are we going to do? How can we do something within the boundaries of legal that makes our system more secure than it is in the confident view that you have?
Yeah. I would say let's see whether the US really takes over Venezuela. Of course, it's a clear step in that direction, but that is not, so to say, a fully done deal. Yeah, I would argue. I would personally argue that there is a big opportunity that is unfolding for Europe for years now. Ultimately, the Russia attack on Ukraine has been a big opportunity for Europe. From my point of view, Europe is more unified than it has ever been since the Second World War build-up phase. There is better European Union UK relationships, better UE Turkey relationships. There is a growing opportunity for global partnerships. Latin American countries are looking to Europe. Canada is looking to Europe. Other players are looking to Europe, as China is also not looking that attractive. Yeah, there is a hell lot of military spending going on in Europe, and there is also a Europe first strategy going on, but it's not as, how to say, pronounced and aggressive as in the US. But of course, European players are also reshoring. European stock indices last year have clearly outperformed US stock indices.
I mean, it's amazing that every time I look at the German DAX, it's up another % or two. I mean, Germany's meant to be dying, and yet the DAX is like on steroids every week.
There is a framing going on, yeah, that is part of the propaganda, if you want, in this global framework, that is constantly talking Europe weak, yeah, from both the left and the right. The reality is very different. The euro gained $10 last year. The dollar lost about 10%. And the dollar lost about 10%. Yeah, Europe has a stable and a predictable demand pattern. Yeah, we know what is going to come. Yes, it will be declined slightly, but it's there every year. It's reliable. You have a lot of regulation. It's true, but you have also very stable regulation. You know what is coming. Yeah, there is not a president in Europe that is changing the game play. The rules every single day. Yeah, so I think also Europe is a highly attractive place for traders. Oil, products, gas. Europe is importing, Europe is exporting. There is all type of opportunities that is creating. Yeah, it's a well-supplied market. It's a well-connected market. There is a lot of storage capacity, but as well, due to the strong supply base on the oil side, it's a very diverse supply base. Stocks, for example, have been run down quite a lot last year on the product side. There's been a period in November where diesel cracks were going through the roof because a lot of market aspects in this complex picture were coming together that all of a sudden Europe was undersupplied, not structurally, but temporarily. Yeah? So for traders, a lot of opportunities. LNG supplies into the European market increased by 30% year on year last year. Yeah, so that's a dynamic market. Yeah, of course.
Speaking of that dynamic market, I mean the LNG piece. As new LNG capacity comes online, does Europe become more structurally more secure, or simply more exposed to short-term price and flow volatility?
That to me, yeah.
Yeah.
I think basically, of course, look, the global.
I mean, Marc made the point of price structure being on the electrification side. Of course, LNG feeds into that.
Yes, but the LNG price is increasingly a global price, and all these additional supplies coming to the market will basically make this underpin this unification further. It will basically be a buyer's market. Yeah, the US facilities in particular, but of course all global facilities will struggle to find buyers. There is no extra demand generation, a significant part from the European side due to price signals. That will be in Asia. Yeah, so basically the marginal oversupply of the market will go to Asia, but prices will be very much kept to the upside and will be very often be close to this probably $2 per MMBTU Henry up. Minimum level. Yeah. So
in some ways, James, luck is Europe's strategy here, is it? We've in that piece of looking forward. I mean, we've mentioned here unification, Europe never been more together, and all of that stuff. Of course, Brexit is the big beast in the room that has sort of created its other element of weak sort of self-harm here. Obviously, the new Labour government is trying to creep along back into a relationship, but missing so many opportunities to just dive right back in again. Your thoughts on the outlook for UK and Europe coming back together into 2026 with a more confident, perhaps, British government, getting on top of energy security, allowing you and your colleagues to get back into the North Sea? I mean, just speak to where Britain comes back to Europe, your outlook for that as part of a strengthening of the de-risking Europe.
Well, if we take up Marc's point, we desperately need a unified Europe with strong leadership. Brexit, and all I'll say about
even
Brexit
if it's hard right?
No, not even
or
if
when
it's hard right. No,
I should say.
No, not even if it's hard right. The difference in the political landscape.
I mean, in Britain, of course, as you know, Nigel Farage Reform Party is leading in the polls, as is the Le Pen in France and the AfD in Germany. All of these far-right parties are, I mean, they're still in minority numbers, but they're still the biggest in the coalition architecture.
European politics is somewhere between centre-left and centre-right when all is said and done, and the difference between those two things is relatively small. But I'll not be led into that. Brexit was the wrong answer to the wrong question. And in some ways, what we are seeing now on our screens in what is being referred to as the coalition of the willing. Now, whilst the coalition of the willing is being addressed to look at the Ukraine situation, I like to think that it won't be far behind it where we get the coalition of the willing looking at energy security. There are three pillars which are driving the European political landscape. And clearly the one which has led very strongly over the course of the last 5 years is climate objectives. But the other two are affordability of power, and that comes back to Marc's point, and the third was energy security. Now, in very recent times, energy security has leapt to the top of the list in terms of that. But affordability of power, affordability of electricity is absolutely massive. I do agree with David that, as I said earlier on, that there is going forward, be an incredible opportunity for Europe, but only if it can access to electricity, which will dominate in terms of the primary energy consumption in Europe over the course of the next 25 years. And currently, electricity prices run somewhere between 2 and 4 times prices elsewhere in the world. Now, that is not just tying down your manufacturing sector, your steel sectors, to the ground with a handicap. It's literally cementing their feet into the ground. You can't move and be competitive. And what we see, whilst we can spin this any way we like, the United Kingdom, which God forbid is often used as an argument that supports Brexit, the wrong answer to the wrong question, with the strongest levels of growth in the EU, arguably, or one of them at 1.4% just now, which is lamentable. Compare that to 7% in India, 6% in Asia. We're just not competitive. It's not even 2.5% as it is in the United States. We've got to get power prices down. We've got to use fuel sources that achieve that. It's got to be sustainable. And if we do that over the medium to longer term, Europe will become increasingly competitive. It's got a short-term problem to get through right now, and it will only do that if it works together and not be fractured.
That's a good segue into my survey question here, because I want you guys to start thinking in our final segment about predictions for the year ahead. You've got to be competitive with cheap energy or lower price energy, or energy that's as low as priced as it is in America or China or elsewhere. But Europe likely will return to Russian gas supply in due course in the aftermath of any peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, as access to cheap energy will be critical to compete globally in a G2 world, i.e. US-China world. big noise in recent weeks and months, and even in the last week on Ukraine-Russia deal, getting Europe lined up with willing to put soldiers on the ground, all of that. So in this idea that 2026 may deliver a breakthrough, 4 years anniversary of the Russia invasion of Ukraine coming up, that the inevitable return to Russian gas, pipeline gas, cheap as chips gas, will be on the cards. Agree or disagree? And with that, Marc, some thoughts on your 2026 predictions that may be notable for European energy supply security as we see it, and the question of returning to Russian gas.
Well, start with the survey question. I disagree with that.
Right.
I think for two reasons. A, Europe.
One, I'm Polish, and
David
two
was
is
talking about diversification, and Europe has learned that lesson now, and
Okay.
it doesn't want so that's very important. Two, I
Well,
think
does
Russia,
that stand up when you think about the commitment to American LNG? I mean, it
it's
is.
still very diversified, and we talk about European sources of supply for its power, and it depends which country you're looking at. Just
Yeah.
crossing the border between France and Germany, you've gone from primarily nuclear to Germany's licorice all sorts.
Yeah.
But I think also the other side of this coin is, does Russia really want to get back into bed with Europe? And I don't think so. I think Europe is
Or will China
fundamentally,
even allow them to sell any gas to Europe?
and India plays an important part in this as well. You're a long-time trade partner on all fronts for Russia. They're probably much more reliable partners in the longer run. So I don't think that solves many problems. I think where the really biggest, well, there are two big obstacles to peace in Ukraine. One is Russia basically can't afford to actually end a war economy, because its economy is now so geared to war. Its banking system is so fragile because of all the loans that have had to be made because of the war. And we're not going to let it, suddenly, because of peace in Ukraine, most likely all we get in any peace settlement type situation of whatever description is basically a frozen conflict. And
so your prediction for 2026 is there's no end to this, the war in Ukraine.
Which in the longer run basically just proves to be a hiatus point, which allows everyone to regroup a little bit, but in the long run, the tension is still there. And that's a negative for Europe, particularly for Germany. Even though there is a lot of trade going on via Central Asia with Russia still, it's not completely cut off in the way that people think it is. That's a little bit by the by. Europe and Russia used to trade a lot together. Russia supplied raw materials, and Europe basically processed them and sold them back to Russia as finished goods. I think that the biggest risks is the other side of this coin is we can't actually see the Ukraine conflict outside of Europe's relationship with the US, and that is where this Greenland question issue comes in, because that the current US administration will use anything in terms of gunboat diplomacy to force Europe, as it did with this poor trade deal that was agreed, in terms of security. So
we got to shift. I must bring in David for his views and predictions for 2026. We see Japan aggressively turning on their nuclear power plants again. A new one to open in the next first quarter to displace 1 million tons of LNG requirement. Germany going to do that?
Mm-hmm. I don't think so. It's a short answer. I also don't think the war will end, and I'm not even sure it's in Europe's interest that the war ends, because I think the pressure on Russia is growing immensely. Euro's prices are currently discounted, I think, $28 per barrel. So the money Russia gets currently for its oil and gas is very little. and the pressure on the Russian economy is growing very strongly, and perhaps it's good if that continues for some time.
James, last word with you. Predictions for 2026. The idea that, as I presented at the start of this segment, that Europe could turn back to Russian gas.
No, I don't think it will. Although it's worth stating that some parts of Europe have never moved away from Russian gas. So France, Belgium, Spain are still significant importers of Russian LNG and will be through till 2027. But I think the European argument has been made on that. I think in 26, coming back to a question you asked me earlier on, I think the United Kingdom's political position will just become continually untenable, and they will have to move back to maximising domestic resource as a part of their energy security mix.
Anything in the 2026 calendar that you say, oh, that's going to do that, or watch for that moment that could happen?
Look, I don't disagree with the UK's very strong move towards offshore wind, and as you know, it's come later than it should have done. But the UK's ability to produce electricity from offshore wind is probably better than anywhere else in Europe, and so that strategy is not wrong. What is wrong is actually existing in isolation, and that if we've had one theme that's run throughout our whole discussion this morning, that's been it. Don't stick to a single argument and put all your eggs in that one basket. And the UK has been doing that for the last 5 years, and it has to move away from it. Europe, I think, in 2026 will continue to get closer and closer together on a coalition of the willing around energy security and energy pricing. It's certainly what I hope to see. I just don't know who the leaders will be.
Well, it certainly will be interesting to see how the British government navigates this ongoing noise around Greenland, because the Keir Starmer's ability to sort of stay both sides of Trump has probably been a signature achievement of the last year, but increasingly it's bending backwards in triple ways that seems impossible. So disagree 73% of this room to a 25%. I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever in the world that Daimler-Benz will be on the phone to Vladimir Putin in half a second. Turn those pipes back on. I need to make cheaper Mercedes-Benz, because that LNG price just popped back up to $15 on JKI or something like that. Anyway, that's a sort of year outlook. The cheap gas coming back to Europe, maybe not this year, maybe not, but certainly the direction of travel. And as James said, it's never stopped. Marc, Ostwald, thank you so much. David Wech, thank you so much. James McCallum, thank you so much. We hope you'll join us in London for our podcaster lunch, as always, in mid-February. But until we see you again soon, thank you for joining the Global Energy Outlook Forum. That wraps up the Asia section of this marathon day. We've been through Asia, we've been through the Middle East, between Europe, and now the real fun begins. The Americans are going to start talking in half an hour. Let's hear what they have to say to digest all this stuff that's been going on. Thank you, guys. All the best.
Thank you, and Happy New Year to you all.
Thank you.
Cheers.